So if we look at this kind of summary of key challenges, again, across literature, across industry, and across any case studies that we are currently working on, I suppose one of the key things that I'm beginning to see more and more of is the misused term of digital transformation. So digital transformation, something that can be confused with digital innovation, can be also used interchangeably with digitization, and I suppose a few other factors around your disruptive digital innovation and things like that. So we've heard from companies that are talking about, for example, updating a website and describing that as digital transformation. Other companies, on the back of COVID, for example, are beginning to look at the challenges around developing apps, and they're describing that as digital transformation. So again, because we lack an agreed, defined perspective of digital transformation, there's a lot of muddied, I suppose, terms and different perspectives of what digital transformation actually means. And therefore, the conversation has gone, I suppose, very broad, very wide in terms of all these different descriptions on digital transformation. Once they've agreed on what the digital transformation might be within companies, one of the key things I'm beginning to see more and more of is the lack of communication or the lack of insight in terms of the rationale to undergo a digital transformation. So you might see at a senior level, the CEO or the CTO have ideas around a digital transformation, but the people that are actually going to operationalize that transformation process have little insight in terms of what is it that we're trying to achieve, what's the business value of trying to do this or undergo this transformation, what technologies do we need to upskill on, and so on. And often that gets lost in terms of how it's filtered down to the people that the front line that are actually going to operationalize the digital transformation process. You also see, I suppose, across industry reports around that gap between aspiration and inspiration. Again, this links back to this misused term of digital transformation. So companies might have an aspiration to be radical and transform how we do business. And in terms of the inspiration, it might actually filter down that they're only actually revamping the website or introducing a new app or something like that. And sometimes that gets lost in translation in terms of that gap between aspiration and the inspiration. I suppose more importantly, when we talk about, I suppose, digital transformation, again, it shouldn't be overestimated, the demands that the pace of change has actually placed on companies, and I suppose executives also, to try and keep abreast with all these changes. So planning to keep up with the pace of IT innovation is something that's extremely difficult. I suppose, some time back, when we talk about a strategy, we used to think of a long-term strategy as being kind of 5+ years. Now we don't have the luxury of that. So what was relevant over a year or two ago may not be, I suppose, the case now, where everybody's talking about the need to adopt AI, for example. That was not kind of so much on the agenda maybe 2 years ago. And now you have companies that are chasing that idea of the need to adopt new technologies at this pace and so on. This presents, I suppose, many challenges in around how you future-proof a digital transformation strategy, because what's relevant today might not be as relevant in 2, 3, or 4 years' time. So that presents many new challenges for companies to try and plan ahead, but at the same time keep it a little loose to adopt new technologies and so on. Then when they have decided to adopt, let's say, AI, for example, now they must go and try and match that strategy with skills, and that can be hugely challenging. Only over the last couple of weeks, I was speaking to industry with members that explained to me about it's one thing to try and strategize for digital transformation, but then try to recruit, try to have that talent pipeline that will actually realize the strategy. Like skill sets in mobile, skill sets in AI, skill sets in cloud are few and far between. So it's one thing to have the aspiration and inspiration even to try and drive that, but in trying to get feet on the ground that will actually implement that is something quite different. I'd often describe this, I suppose, to students even around trying to build the executive engine almost as being the car or the vehicle of change. So you have to have obviously these key ingredients of mindset, the culture, the change in practice, and with all of this also there's a change in roles. So it's important to look at what I describe as trying to lift the bonnet as such, to try and look at what that engine looks like within the organization. Everybody can aspire to try and digitally transform, but if you haven't got the engine, or if you haven't got the mechanics to actually operationalize that, then it's probably a waste of resources and a waste of kind of investment into things that you can't really realistically achieve. So that whole readiness assessment to look at digital transformation is something that's also a challenge at the moment. In a recent case study that we did for your financial institution, they've described, I suppose, a key issue that, and it keeps cropping up across certain sectors, is this idea of transforming while also trying to do business. So on one hand, you're trying to rip out the core, I suppose, business model that you operated on for the last couple of decades and transform that in a digital, I suppose, context while doing business. And they find that quite challenging in terms of how do you radically transform, but at the same time, try to keep the lights on and do business on a day-to-day basis. And more fundamentally, the final challenge there is the high failure rate. So how do you become, I suppose, engaged in a process where there's kind of such a high failure rate? How do you put all your eggs in one basket to try and really support and build, new initiatives around change and so on? So that's kind of where I kind of see the key challenges, as a launch pad really for further research. So the question is, and I suppose for anybody that's dialed in here, so where is it all going wrong? And this is something that really puzzled me when I began to look at the high failure rates of digital transformation. So we all know that there's a perfect mix between people, technology, processes, and so on. And central to that, I guess, is strategy. If you look at a recent, I suppose, article by Bonnet and Westerman, they describe, well, if companies are not going to digitally transform, they're at the risk of falling behind other companies. So it's either a question of trying to digitally transform or be left behind and become, I suppose, irrelevant in practice. So it's important that every organization begins to look at, I suppose, opportunities to digitally transform. But at the same time, you have to be conscious of, and I suppose in the last year, we've become more, I suppose, attuned to the idea of digital transformation on the back of COVID-19. So it's really a matter of trying to look at transforming and accelerating all these new norms. And behind all of this, it really gave us, I suppose, an appreciation that some of the old ways of doing business are quite vulnerable. They're quite open to issues like COVID-19, for example. And the traditional way of doing business is no longer sustainable. It's important to look at alternative options in terms of how you might transform how you do business and use, I suppose, digital assets to try and achieve that. That whole digital transformation process then is something that we need to really dig a little deeper on. So I've been talking to my son, he's 6 years old, about digital transformation. He hears me going on about it quite a lot. And he was asking me, what exactly was it? So I was trying to break it down into, I suppose, everyday kind of terms. And he's become a huge fan of Formula One. And I began to see, I suppose, a lot of overlaps. And I almost use this now as an analogy around the different layers of the transformation process. So I've no clue of Formula One, but he's educated me on that. But he talks about the evolution, I suppose, of change, where he talks about different cars over the last couple of years. He talks about, like, different kind of headsets, different equipment and all that kind of stuff. Things that he just kind of picks up off the cuff, where I began to look at, there's a lot of similarities between this Formula One analogy around the evolution of change. Every car or every company has a sponsor and a champion. There's always a leader or a driver. They're always exploiting new technologies to try and get faster, to try and get better, to try and improve that chance of winning. There's a huge emphasis on agility, to try and be an agile driver, but also to look at planning and strategy, around the race to be more agile. You've got to be very dynamic in terms of response rates and everything else. The emphasis, again, kind of similar to digital transformation, is on speed and pace of change. You'll see that there's constantly a revamp of new team structures. And nowadays, from what I'm beginning to see, it's very much, I suppose, data-driven. It's very much kind of led by the mechanics as such on the sidelines and the team managers and so on. And in addition, they're always monitoring their competition, more so than themselves. So by understanding more about the competition, you begin to understand ways to transform processes and practices and so on. So I've got a short clip here, if you'll entertain me, just to kind of show you the change in our expectation, the change in the transformation process, and what that means if you think about it from a digital perspective. So if you just bear with me for a second, I'll play this.
But Holland comes in for a pit stop. Time to refuel and change tires. Lou Moore himself changes the tires. Only 4 crew members, including the driver, are allowed to work on the car. It's a tense time. Holland stays in his seat, anxious to get away. Let's watch. The tires are changed at last. A crewman polishes the windshield as Holland moves away just 67 seconds after he stopped.
So I use this sometimes, I suppose, as part of classes in the area of managing digital transformation, but it's really to highlight the evolution of change, how technology, new roles, new, I suppose, considerations around agility has changed our perspective on how you transform what is very simple, I suppose, in this case, a race. And the same thing, I guess, is happening in business with the evolution of technology, with the evolution of new expectations on users. This has also changed the transformation process itself. And it was worth highlighting that I consider this to be almost like the moving target. And the question that I often pose for organizations is, how do organizations actually then embed that transformation in this so-called constantly changing world in terms of a digital context? So if new evolutions of technology, like if it's AI, cloud, or IoT, for example, is constantly changing and evolving, how do companies then begin to actually strategize and implement and embed, for long term, that kind of sense of change? And that was a question that really, I suppose, kind of haunted me for some time. And I began to look at it in a little more detail. And I began to see that a lot of literature, again, focuses on that evolving kind of digital landscape. It looks at that left-hand side around new technologies, new innovations, and so on. And we often know that there's a 70% failure rate and obviously a 30% success rate. But what we know less about, I think, is that actual kind of black box, that transformation and what's happening in there. And I suppose I'm putting more push in terms of research on that at the moment to try and uncover what's actually happening in that black box. And I suppose the main perspective that I'm taking is around, I suppose, normalization process theory. So again, you have the evolving kind of digital landscape on the left. And here I'm beginning to lift the hood on this digital transformation process. And this normalization process theory has been used in implementation science largely, but it's largely looking at how you embed change, how you begin to sustain it, how you begin to integrate new technologies, new innovations, but more importantly, how you sustain that long term. And it breaks it up into, I suppose, a number of different constructs. I just highlight them in gray here just for simplicity. We're talking about coherence, which largely focuses on the sense-making process around what's the rationale for this digital transformation. Cognitive participation looks at okay, now that you've decided to go and undergo a digital transformation, how do you enroll new actors? How do you enroll new people and groups to now drive that change? Collective action then looks at, okay, now that you've adopted the change, how does this now work with the existing system, the new, or like the existing organization that you work within? And then the final one on reflective monitoring looks at how does the individual or the group or the wider organization now view the change of this digital transformation in terms of the organization, in terms of teams, in terms of organizational structures and group dynamics and so on. I've just got a citation at the bottom there if anybody's interested in learning a little bit more around normalization process theory. But I suppose if you bring this to organizations, then there's always a fear that, okay, that might be a little theoretical and so on. But just to kind of demonstrate how we can communicate it a little better, if I was to ask, what's the likely kind of success of this transformation? So coherence, for example, again, is a sense-making process. Cognitive participation is where people are supporting and kind of tuned in to actually contributing towards the transformation. Your collective action then, is that all the groups are contributing towards that change and new roles. And reflective monitoring is the kind of metrics or the analytics that go behind our understanding of change and so on. So in this case, you can tell that the very new start in terms of coherence, it's on a very weak and shaky foundation. There's a lack of understanding as what the rationale for the change is, and understanding the need to undergo a transformation. Cognitive participation, you can see it's weak in terms of there's a lack of understanding as how people are going to actually fit in and contribute towards the change. And collective action, you can see there's lack of contribution towards, or lack of understanding towards how people are going to integrate this with the already existing system. You can see that it scores quite well in reflective monitoring. So you can tell that it's very much a data-driven organization that it places a lot of emphasis on analytics, but on top of a very weak foundation of understanding the need for change and who's going to drive the change. You can tell that this will probably be one of those organizations that will be added to the failure rate. So I'm working on the assessment process even further, and I'd welcome any opportunity to collaborate with people out there. So in terms of future research, just to close it off, I see a huge opportunity again around theorizing about digital transformation, specifically around the transformation process. Looking also at opportunities to evaluate organizations and guide them through that normalization process about how you embed, how you integrate, and more importantly, how do you sustain that long-term transformation process? I'm looking at building the assessment process around transformation. So again, it's building on NPT, the normalization process theory, and kind of adopting ways that we can look at readiness for change or evaluating change in a retrospective perspective also. So I'm also open to collaboration with industry, particularly how we can look at delivering value and impact. And I think that's something that cropped up earlier that Bodhi mentioned. It's important to realize that it's constantly evolving in terms of the digital aspects. So therefore, we should really look at ways of how we improve the value in the business perspectives. What are the fundamental core pillars, regardless of the technology? What are the core pillars when we talk about the transformation process? And I believe that normalizing and that whole normalization process is something that will kind of help us to learn a little bit more around what drives that success and failure and so on. So I'm conscious of time, so that closes me off. If anybody's interested in contacting me or following up on this from an academic perspective or industry perspective, I welcome the opportunity to discuss it further. You can reach me on any of them. So thank you for that.
Very good, Noel. And thanks so much. So I think it's a really good oversight, of end-to-end digital transformation. And again, I welcome, anyone that wishes to ask questions. Please feel free. There's a Q&A section here. There's a chat. Just one question, Noel, and I'm sort of conscious of time as well. Is that radial diagram you just showed us, would that be typical of the types of arrangements you'd see in organizations, i.e. very low in terms of coherence, maybe low in terms of cognitive participation, but maybe some of the other elements a bit stronger then? Would that be fairly typical?
So well, it does differ across organizations, and it depends on the scale of the organization or the size of them. Oftentimes the digital transformation strategies can be, can be developed at the executive suite level, and then it fails to filter down. So we try to engage with people that are actually going to operationalize the change. So rather than just speaking to the senior executives, the people that are actually going to drive the frontline change, if they don't understand the rationale for change or the need for change, then the likelihood is that that effort will dwindle, it won't become embedded, and it won't sustain long term. And you really just, I guess it's a matter of time before it begins to dissolve, I guess, over time. So I suppose we're particularly interested to see how that message and that motivation is filtered down to the frontline people that will actually drive the change and implement it. And ultimately, it's the frontline people that are going to sustain that change. And if they don't understand or back in any way or support what you're trying to achieve, it will eventually kind of fade. And I think that's one of the reasons that's leading to that failure rate. That your sense of belief doesn't pass the executive suite as such.
And Noel, like, this day and age, and we've known this is an issue for decades and decades, whether it's from the project management literature, it's from the innovation literature, or wherever. Why are we still at this juncture where there's a motivation that doesn't filter down, there's a vision that doesn't filter down?
Yeah, and I began to question this as well, like, around the whole area of digital transformation. And the question is, like, what's different? I think fundamentally it's the scale and it's the pace of change. I don't know if we have the time or the tool set to to implement that and I suppose cater for that speed and complexity and scale of change. And I guess if you look at the external environment in terms of digital innovation, it's changing so quickly. Trying to keep up with that, I think there's a sense that we're trying to embed change, but at the same time, we're looking over the garden fence to see what our competitors are doing and trying to look at how do we now move on to the next thing and the next thing. So so again, it comes back to that whole rationale and coherence, that whole sense making around why are you transforming? And what is it that you're trying to transform? Is it internal operations? Is it external markets? And some companies would actually struggle with that question. They just know they need to transform because others are trying to achieve something else as well externally. So in some cases, it's a matter of trying to keep up with the pace. But if you actually break it down, it could be something that's quite of an internal issue that can be addressed without having to invest in AI or IoT or whatever that might be. So it's understanding the rationale for change, I believe, is the foundation for any undertaking.
Yeah, you would think so. And I see here lots of comments, some questions coming in, and feel free maybe to respond to those. They're coming through chat there, I think. Some maybe, I think, is it Barry saying that very often the strategy is on a PowerPoint slide deck and it goes no further, So look, I think there's comments there. Also, Noel, again, you're a great collaborator with us, in UCC and on things digital transformation. Feel free to share if you want on the chat there your LinkedIn profile or whatever way. I know it's on your slide deck as well, but how people can contact you. Noel, thanks a million.
Thanks, Bodie. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, good man. So